Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to AJ102 Introduction to Criminal Justice. My name is Tony Farrar, and of course, I am your instructor for this semester. So, this week's lecture is going to cover Chapter 16, where we're going to take a look at crime and justice in the new millennium. So, we're going to look at things like corporate crime, what they call green crime, cyber crime, transnational crime or organized crime. We'll look a little bit about terrorism and then the future of criminal justice. So we've got a lot to cover. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. So some of our objectives for this lecture will be to explain the influence of globalization on crime, discuss some of the impacts of corporate enterprise on crime, evaluate the various forms of green crime. We'll talk a little bit about cybercrime, what is being done to deal with cyber criminals, the concept. We're going to define the concept of transnational crime. We'll take a look at terrorism and describe the factors that motivate terrorists. We'll discuss some forms of contemporary terrorism, explain how the criminal justice system is going to fight terrorism, and then identify some trends that are likely to influence criminal justice in the future. So what are some of those things that might take place that we need to take a closer look at? So we'll start with globalization, but before that, just kind of note that in this chapter, we're going to review several independent yet interrelated emerging criminal activities that basically are presenting challenges for the criminal justice system. Things like corporate crime, green crime, cybercrime, organized crime, and even terrorism. They're all linked here because really in each category, the offenders or the suspects basically twist the rules of commerce for criminal enterprise or criminal purpose. And through distinct and independent, distinct and independent, these emerging types of crime, they often overlap. And we'll take a little bit of a look at how they kind of overlap. And then as we get to the end of the chapter, we'll delve into terrorism and look at what some of the definitions are, varieties, motivations, etc. So we'll start off with globalization. So the new global economy is a particularly vexing development for agents or those involved in the criminal justice system because it really kind of vastly expands the reach of criminal organizations, while at the same time creating new opportunities for criminal conspiracies. So the term globalization refers to the process of creating transnational markets and political and legal systems. And globalization has shifted the focus of crime from kind of a local to a more of a worldwide kind of perspective. So know that the term globalization refers to the process of creating a global economy through these larger, worldwide transnational markets and political and legal systems. And globalization began initially when large companies decided to establish themselves in foreign markets by adapting their products or services to that local culture. Okay, and then the process kind of took off with the fall of the Soviet Union, which opened new European markets. The development of China into an industrial superpower encouraged foreign investors to take advantage of, the huge supply of workers, etc. And as the internet and communication revolution kind of unfolded, companies were able to establish instant communications with their, far away corporate empires, kind of a technological breakthrough that further boosted trade along foreign investment. So really, I mean, it's not surprising then that globalization has created kind of a fertile ground for contemporary criminal enterprise. By expanding the reach of both criminal and non-criminal organizations, globalization also increases the vulnerability of indigenous people to have a normal way of life. So with money and power to spare, criminal organizations can basically recruit new people, right? New members. They can bribe government officials, and they can even fund things like private armies. So, that's kind of a sad thing, right? That they can do all that stuff. And, even more so, international organized crime has kind of globalized its activities for the same reasons that basically impel legitimate multinational corporations to expand around the world, right? New markets bring new sources of profits. So, it's expanding those profits and those markets. Now, Louis Shelley basically argues that two elements of globalization have the potential to encourage criminality. The first would be technological advances. So, commercial airline traffic, telecommunications, the internet, international trade, facilitated cross-border movements of goods and people. So these technological advances. And then on top of that, basically free markets and fair trade, facilitated cross-border movements of good and people, and the freedom to travel to regions from which they basically cannot be extradited. So all of these two things really have kind of facilitated the potential to encourage criminality, right? When you kind of look at that, transnational crime groups, they typically and aggressively exploit this freedom to travel to regions from where they couldn't be extradited from, based on their operations in countries with ineffective or corrupt law enforcement, and launder their money in countries with, basically bank secrecy or few effective controls. So globalization has allowed both individual offenders and these criminal organizations and criminal gangs, etc., to gain tremendous operational benefits, and has basically markedly reduced the risk of apprehension and punishment. So being able to go to these other places, right? So what are some of the things then that we're kind of looking at? Well, let's talk about corporate crime first. So in the late 30s, criminologist Edwin Sutherland first used the phrase white-collar crime to describe the criminal activities of those that are rich and powerful. And white-collar crime is generally non-violent in nature and includes things like public corruption, healthcare fraud, mortgage fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, just to name a few of the different types of illegal activities. And white-collar scams can destroy a company, devastate families by basically wiping out their life savings, or cost investors billions of dollars, or even all three, for that matter. So, we have to understand that there's things called Ponzi schemes, and we'll talk a little bit about that, on how they're kind of fraudulent scams that have ripped people off out of a lot of money. And when we talk about corporate enterprise crime, this involves, illegal activities of people and organizations whose acknowledged purpose is to profit through illegitimate business enterprise. Illegal, illegitimate, okay? The creation of the global capital markets has created kind of a unprecedented opportunity for business to access capital and investors to basically, diversify their portfolios. So a lot of, kind of things for us to consider, right? When it comes to like white collar crime and and different things like that. So what are some of the, types of kind of fraud schemes, specifically as you look at things like on Wall Street? Could be market manipulation or high yield investment fraud, advance fee fraud, hedge funds, commodities fraud, foreign exchange fraud, broker embezzlement, or even things that are called like late day trading. These are all things that kind of come about, right? And perhaps one of the greatest of these crimes was pulled off by financier Bernard Madoff, who operated Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. And this was a Ponzi scheme. And a Ponzi scheme is an investment fraud that involves the payment of, basically reported returns to existing investors from the funds contributed by new investors. So it's a scam, right? The largest Ponzi scheme in history, worth about probably $65 billion. And yes, he was finally arrested, tried, and convicted and sentenced to 150 years. But still, and in this scheme, Madoff had not invested any of the money that he had taken from the investors. Instead, he deposited all this money in these different banks and basically reported that the companies, that was bringing a profit and making all of this money and things like that. So again, these are Ponzi schemes. Now, kind of moving a little bit forward, during 2008 and 2009, the nation was basically rocked again by another form of Wall Street fraud, and this was basically the subprime mortgage scandal. And this was kind of it was almost like a 1929 style crash, the collapse of the mortgage system. And, as a result of this financial disaster, several prominent institutions like Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and these big companies went out of business. Banks like IndyMac and Washington Mutual basically failed, and the federal government was forced to provide over $1 trillion in relief to keep some of these other companies afloat, like the American Insurance Group, AIG, or Citigroup, etc. And again, the cornerstone of this crisis was the collapse of the mortgage kind of, sector. And a subprime mortgage is a home loan given to a borrower who basically, because of inadequate income, wouldn't ordinarily qualify for a bank loan. And once these subprime loans have been issued, the vendors typically bundle them into large pools and then sell them as securities, a process that we call securitization. And because they carry risk, they typically pay a higher interest rate than normal securities, making them a little attractive to investors. But by 2006, the subprime had grown to 20% of the mortgage market, up from 2% from a decade earlier, which means that an estimated 1.3 trillion of the 4.5 trillion in outstanding loans were basically, subprime. So we had a lot of issues. And on page 620 in your textbook, it talks about these high yield investment frauds and what an advance fee fraud is and what a hedge fund fraud, commodities fraud, foreign exchange fraud, broker embezzlement, and even late day trading. So it kind of gives you a little bit of kind of a definition of each one of those. So again, on page 620, and then it kind of moves over to 621. So, still staying with the mortgage scandal, not only has the availability of subprime mortgages presented opportunities for people to commit fraud, but it also arrested scams designed to prey upon people who obtained mortgages and then couldn't pay them. And these were basically what they call foreclosure rescue scams, with phantom help and bailout and what they call bait and switch. So a lot of these things were kind of taking place. Phantom help basically is described as desperate homeowners are offered help by kind of a supposed expert in avoiding foreclosures. then they're basically stuck with the charges for things that they could have done on their own, right? Like calling the bank and doing simple things like that. And a bailout in this scam, someone offers to bail out the homeowner by taking the house off their hands with the promise that they can stay in as renters and then buy the house back once things are fixed. But that's really not the way it works. The homeowner soon finds out that they can't buy the house back, and the equity that was in there is basically gone. And then the bait and switch is where scammers tell the victim that they're signing documents for a new loan that's going to solve their problem, but in reality, they're signing forged documents that transfer ownership of that particular house, right, or that particular building. So these are some of the issues that are, when you talk about mortgage scandal. Then there's the builder bailout schemes. The housing crisis also induced basically unscrupulous home builders to engage in fraud in order to unload unsold homes. Buyers have been, offered incentives of a mortgage with no down payment in order to get them to buy a house that they really couldn't afford, right? So it kind of makes sense. So for example, say a builder wants to sell a property for $300,000, a price that allows that person to make a profit. Well, he inflates the value to $360,000, finds buyers offering to give him $360,000 to be used, $60,000 as a down payment. The buyers then go to the bank and show that they owe $300,000 on a $360,000 property. The lender funds the mortgage in $300,000, believing that $60,000 was paid to the builder and the borrower, but it's kind of a fraud. The whole thing is a scheme. So I know it can be a little confusing, but this is the builder bailout scheme. They also have things like management fraud. Sometimes executives in large corporations take advantage of their positions to engage in, management fraud, which typically involves falsifying financial information for their own benefit. They create false accounting entries, bogus trades. They use insider trading. They get kickbacks, backdating stock options, misappropriation of company property. And there were a couple of big companies, in some cases that did this. Tyco International, in 2005, their chief executive officer, basically, and their chief financial officer were convicted on a variety of fraud and larceny charges, including misappropriating $170 million in company funds. Enron, executives of this, oil and gas trading giant, basically once one of the largest companies in the U.S., engaged in massive fraud schemes that caused the company to go bankrupt. WorldCom in 2005, CEO, his name was Bernie Ebbers, was found guilty of falsifying the company's financial statements for more than $9 billion. And one of the most important elements of this case was the more than $400 million that WorldCom basically lent or guaranteed to lend Ebbers at an interest rate of basically 2.15%. So again, just different types of management scams, if you will. So with all of that said, and then again, just a little bit of a note on page 623, it talks about common mortgage fraud schemes. There's kind of a list of each one and what they are by definition. So what are some strategies then to control corporate crime? Well, there are some, strategies, and the first would be civil law strategies. So one approach to controlling corporate crime relies on the threat of economic sanctions or civil penalties to control potential violators and gain their compliance with regulations. Another one would be criminal law strategies, right? And these strategies rely on the threat of punishment of the individual offenders to deter other violators. And these are deterrent strategies, basically orientated or goaled towards apprehending violators and punishing them criminally, rather than creating conditions that just want to make people conform, right? So these are ones where when you talk about criminal strategies, they want to put people in jail. They don't want to just make you conform like civil law strategies. They're after compliance, and they use economics, money to make you comply. Criminal law is different, right? Not only does it want to deter other offenders, but here the strategy is to prosecute you and punish you criminally rather than just getting you to conform. Okay, so when we talk about, we're still talking about corporate crime or corporate enterprise crime. We'll talk a little bit about the detention and enforcement of corporate crime, or it should be actually detection. So the detection and enforcement of large-scale corporate crime is primarily in the hands of administrative departments and agencies with investigative arms to police these particular areas of commerce, right, that fall under their purview. And that kind of makes sense, right? So, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission has responsibility for overseeing the nation's capital markets. It is assigned the tasks of protecting investors as well as maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient economic markets. So we kind of see that. And usually the decision to pursue criminal rather than civil violations is based on a couple of things. One being the seriousness of the case, and then two being the company, the perpetrator, the person's intent. Okay, the actions to conceal the violation, and then of course any other prior record, and that's kind of how they would look at whether or not they wanted to basically go after anyone. And any evidence of criminal activity is then basically identified, figured out, sent to the Department of Justice or the FBI in order to investigate it. But there are other agencies, other federal agencies that do this. The Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Postal Service, the Federal Trade Commission. There are other agencies that get involved in this as well. Okay, so that was probably new to a lot of you, but just understand that globalization can create opportunities for people to scam people, right? So now let's talk a little bit about green crime. So on April 20th, 2010, an explosion occurred on the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, killing 11 platform workers and injuring 17 others. And this rig was built by basically Hyundai Heavy Industries of Korea, owned by Transocean Drilling Corporation, the drilling overseen by a company called Hilibatron and leased by BP, formerly British Petroleum. So a lot of stuff to kind of think about, right? And basically to drill deep water, 5,000 feet, below the surface, in the Gulf of Mexico. And at first, kind of estimates of the spill were about 5,000 barrels a day, but they quickly rose to about 60,000 a day. And while company officials frantically tried to stem the flow with a variety of failed schemes, millions of barrels of oil escaped and a slick covered thousands of square miles, etc. This is just kind of an interesting thing. And if you ever watched the movie Deepwater Horizon, it was actually pretty cool. But green collar crime is criminal activity that involves violating rules and laws designed to protect the environment, people, or both. And there really is a reason for a lot of this, right? So forms of green crime could be, issues like we talked about relating to the oil companies, or illegal logging, illegal fishing, illegal pollution. Okay, all of these things kind of fall into this particular area. And I talked about this a little bit, in the aftermath of this particular case, this BP case. BP agreed to pay $4.5 billion in fines and other penalties and pled guilty to 14 criminal charges related to an explosion that happened on the rig. So not only was there a leak, but there was a devastating explosion. Okay, and remember, killing 11 platform workers and injuring 17. If you haven't watched the movie, you really should watch it. It's actually super interesting, and you can see how the ownership is basically, not worried about safety and other issues that could happen, but instead they're more worried about time frames and making quota and making money. Okay, so that's kind of the thing there. Now, with that said, excuse me, we know that, we can do some things to enforce some of the laws, right? So the United States and most nations have passed laws making it a crime to pollute or damage the environment. And we have some of those that are listed on page 627. It talks about the Clean Water Act, right? That this was back in 1972, that establishes and maintains goals and standards for water quality and purity. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act requires companies to disclose information about toxic chemicals. You have the Endangered Species Act in 1990 that basically is designed to protect and recover endangered and or threatened species of fish and wildlife and plants in the U.S. And you even have the Oil Pollution Act in 1990 that was enacted in the aftermath of, if you remember, the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska's Prince William Sound. And this law basically streamlined the federal response to oil spills by requiring storage facilities and vessels to prepare spill response plans and provide for their rapid response and implementation. So, again, this is kind of green crime. Well, what about things like cybercrime then? So in October of 2013, law enforcement officials shut down the infamous Silk Road website, basically an online marketplace in which users could use what is known as a kind of a Tor, or it's called an onion router service, to browse anonymously and securely, looking to do everything from purchasing illegal drugs to hiring a hitman. And Silk Road was part of a so-called deep web or deep net, which consists of World Wide Web content that is not basically indexed by standard search engines, and therefore it lies beneath the internet, the web's surface. So it's hard to get to, and there's only certain ways to get there. So what then is cybercrime? Well, cybercrime is illegal activity that uses a computer as its primary means of commission, and common forms of cybercrime include theft and destruction of information, resources, and funds. So, and we'll talk about a couple of other definitions as well, but cybercrime is just one of the big things that's out there, because you can basically do this, right, from anywhere. And this new, kind of category of crime, if you will, presents a kind of compelling challenge for the justice system and law enforcement community, because it's it's rapidly evolving with new schemes every day. It's really difficult to detect and solve through normal police investigations or normal challenges, and actually even to try to control it. And to try to control it, investigators have to develop new technical skills that perhaps they never had before, right? So it's really difficult. It is even possible that the recent decline in crime is actually a result of cybercrime kind of replacing traditional street crime. You kind of don't have to rob anybody else at gunpoint if you can do it over the computer, right? Or you can hack into some bank's database, or get someone's identity and falsely apply for a loan, or hack a bank account, or clone a credit card, or different things like that. So it's kind of replaced. It's kind of like how the internet has replaced our regular brick and mortar stores. Like, whether it's clothing stores, shoe stores, sporting goods stores. You don't have to go to those stores anymore. You can order it at Amazon or on the web. Cybercrime is kind of the same thing. You don't really have to go out and commit some of these other crimes because you can do a lot of it over the web, right? So it really is, it's difficult to deal with. And, the internet coupled with more powerful computers, etc., is now kind of the medium choice, if you will, for providing a wide range of services from entertainment and communication to research and even education. The cyber age has also generated a lot of money, right? Worldwide IT spending is projected to kind of approach 4 trillion by 2020, magnifying the importance of the internet, and that it is in fact that many critical infrastructure functions ranging from things like banking to control of shipping, everything is kind of on the web, right? And so this vast network has now become the target for illegal activities. And one of those could be, we talked about, cyber crime, but more definitive, cyber theft. Some criminals use this modern technology to get stuff, accumulate goods and services. And cyber theft schemes range from copyright theft to using technology to commit more traditional theft-based offenses like larceny or fraud. And cyber criminals now have the luxury of remaining anonymous, living almost anywhere on the planet, right? Conducting their business during the day or night, working alone or even in a group. And the reach to victims is unlimited because it's just on the computer. And you've probably seen some of the scams out there too. So, cyber theft again involves the use of computer networks for criminal profits. And some of the most common methods of cyber theft would be computer fraud. Copyright infringement, internet securities fraud. The biggest one, identity theft. Okay, and then we'll talk a little bit about e-tailing fraud, but we'll kind of go through each one of these individually. But identity theft really, really is kind of one of the number one, if you will. Okay, so just kind of going through a little bit here as we in more detail. So again, some of the most common methods of cyber theft are identity theft. This occurs when a person uses the internet to steal someone's identity and or impersonate the victim to open a new credit card account or conduct some other financial transaction. It is one of the fastest growing types of cyber theft out there. And it is very, very difficult to basically track and to identify. And really, again, identity theft can damage a person's good name, inflict severe losses and inconvenience by basically manipulating credit records or depleting bank accounts. And some identity thieves create false emails or even websites that look legitimate but are designed to basically gain illegal access to someone's personal information. And there's a name for that, and we'll talk about it in just a few minutes. So again, talking about some other methods of cyber theft, one would be e-tailing fraud. These are new fraud schemes that are evolving to exploit the fact that billions of dollars of goods are sold on the internet each year. And e-tailing fraud can involve both buying and selling merchandise illegally on the internet. So that's kind of what e-tailing means. I talked a minute ago about bank accounts and things like that. Phishing, also known as carding or spoofing, consists of illegally acquiring personal information from someone, like bank passwords or credit card info, masquerading as a legitimate, trustworthy person. So you might get this email here, right, from Bank of America, and you can see that the email address is kind of bogus, right? Undisclosed recipients. And Bank of America, they're not going to email you here, but it's a dear member, we detected unusual activity on your account. For your protection, verify this info. Sign in here with all of your stuff. This is called phishing, and people actually do this. So before you just jump in and you click on some FedEx delivery thing or some Bank of America thing, anytime a company's asking for info, you should be very, very curious as to why. Okay, we'll finish up with a couple things and we'll take our first break, and then we'll come on back, okay? So other things that have kind of gained popularity, if you will. The IT revolution has also revitalized the pornography industry. The internet is an ideal venue for selling and distributing adult material. The computer is also the ideal device for storing and viewing it. And we do have to kind of keep in mind that, we have the First Amendment, right, that makes legal control of pornography a little bit difficult. And there is the Child Pornography Prevention Act of 1996. But, kind of keep in mind, because of their vast numbers, it's really difficult to estimate how many websites feature, inappropriate content, including photos, videos, and other things, right? Webcam sessions, among other forms of this type of entertainment. And, we really don't know the number of web pages, that is soared over time relating to this. Revenue from internet sites like this comes from a number of sources: paid subscriptions, advertisements, fees for diverting web traffic to other sites, all this different kind of stuff. And the government has moved to control the broadcast of obscene films via satellite and other technology innovations. However, again, remember, the First Amendment right to free speech makes legal control of pornography, quite difficult, right? So it is kind of tough. Now, in 1996, as I said a moment ago, Congress again attempted to control the growth of internet porn sites when it passed the Child Pornography Prevention Act. And this expanded the federal prohibition on child pornography to include not only pornographic images made using actual children, but also any visual depiction that is or appears to be of a minor engaging in some type of explicit conduct. But it's very difficult to control and to get a handle on. Cyber vandalism. Some cyber criminals may be motivated not by greed or profit, but by the thirst for revenge, by the desire to inflict basically destruction, or by other malicious intent. And so cyber vandalism involves malicious attacks aimed at disrupting, defacing, and or destroying technology. And you can look at the chart here, the total cost of cybercrime, over the different years, right? So it's quite a bit of things that we have to consider. Cybercrime with malicious intent covers a lot of different areas. And some common characteristics of these cyber criminals: some desire, again, to exhibit their technical prowess, if you will, superiority. Some wish to highlight the vulnerability of computer systems. Some want to spy on other people's private financial and personal information. And then some want to destroy computer security because they believe in open access of all systems and programs. So just some different types of things. All right, so when we come back, we'll take our first break now, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some types of cyber vandalism. And there are some interesting ones for us to look at. So we'll come back with part 2 in just a few.